Montana Territory, November 1877. While seasoned frontiersmen were hauling their final loads of firewood into chinked log cabins, preparing for the brutal winter ahead, one man was doing something that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching. Thomas Whitfield, a 34-year-old trapper from Pennsylvania, was living in what the settlers called a savage's tent, a conical structure of canvas and hide that looked like it belonged to the Blackfeet encampments 20 miles north, not to a white man who claimed to know about survival. "He'll freeze before Christmas," muttered Jacob Hensley, a carpenter who'd built 17 cabins in the Bitterroot Valley. "That rag won't hold heat worth a damn." The other settlers agreed. They'd invested weeks of backbreaking labor into their log structures, some with walls 14 inches thick, foundations of river stone, and fireplaces built by masons who'd learned their trade in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Whitfield's dwelling looked like something a man would abandon after one hard frost. But Whitfield wasn't listening to the mockery. He was watching, measuring, and quietly applying principles of thermal engineering that most of his neighbors had never even considered. What did this lone trapper understand about heat retention that experienced builders with decades of frontier construction knowledge had completely missed? Before we reveal the answer that would transform an entire region's approach to winter survival, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what the coldest winter night you've ever experienced was. Because what you're about to learn isn't just history. It's survival knowledge that could literally save your life in extreme conditions. And if you stick with me until the end, I'll show you the exact measurements that proved the experts catastrophically wrong. The cultural collision was inevitable. Thomas Whitfield had arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1877, following the beaver streams that wound through the Mission Mountains. Unlike the homesteaders flooding westward with land claims and farming dreams, Whitfield had spent the previous 3 winters living among the Cheyenne and Wyoming Territory, learning their methods, their materials, their engineering. When he pitched his modified teepee at the edge of the settlement near present-day Stevensville, the reaction was immediate and harsh. "Look at that fool," said Henry Bradshaw, a former Union Army quartermaster who'd supervised the construction of winter barracks in Virginia. "Thinks he's going to winter in a damn Indian lodge while the rest of us are burning cords of wood just to keep the frost off our walls." Bradshaw's cabin was a monument to conventional frontier wisdom. 12 by 16 feet of interlocked spruce logs, gaps chinked with clay and moss, a stone fireplace that consumed a quarter cord of split pine every 36 hours. By the standards of 1877 Montana, it was solid construction. Whitfield's structure looked absurd by comparison. It was a cone approximately 16 feet in diameter at the base, rising 14 feet to a smoke hole at the apex. The outer layer was heavy canvas he'd purchased in Fort Benton. The inner layer, and this is what really confused the settlers, was a second cone of tanned elk hide, suspended 18 inches inside the outer wall, creating a complete air gap that ran from ground level to about 7 feet up. "He's doubled up his walls like he don't trust his own construction," laughed Samuel Morton, who'd built his cabin with walls so thick they'd consumed 43 trees. "Probably leaks like a sieve." But Whitfield wasn't concerned with their opinions. He was concerned with physics. He'd positioned the dwelling with mathematical precision, entrance facing east, away from the prevailing northwest winds. The floor was excavated 8 inches below ground level, lined with river stones, then covered with a layer of dried grass, then buffalo hides, then woven willow mats. Each layer served a specific thermal purpose that the log cabin builders hadn't even considered. The fire pit sat dead center, exactly 127 inches from every wall, a circular depression lined with flat creek stones that had been carefully selected for their density and heat retention properties. "You planning to heat that whole circus tent with that little fire?" Bradshaw asked one November afternoon, watching Whitfield arrange his stones. "You'll be begging for a spot in a real cabin by January." Whitfield just smiled. We'll see what January brings. What Thomas Whitfield understood, and what the cabin builders had completely missed, was that heating a frontier dwelling wasn't about building the biggest fireplace or burning the most wood. It was about managing heat in three distinct forms: conduction, convection, and radiation. The log cabins were thermal disasters, though their builders would never admit it. Every horizontal log created a thermal bridge, a pathway for heat to escape directly through the wood to the frigid exterior. The squared corners created dead air pockets where convection currents died and frost accumulated. The massive stone fireplaces, while impressive, radiated 60% of their heat straight up the chimney and out into the Montana night. Whitfield's teepee worked on completely different principles. The conical shape eliminated corners entirely. Heat rose naturally to the peak, but instead of escaping through a wide chimney, it passed through a smoke hole barely 14 inches in diameter, small enough to create a natural draft for the fire, but too small to hemorrhage warm air. But the real genius was the double wall system. That 18-inch air gap between the outer canvas and inner hide liner created what modern engineers would call a thermal buffer zone. Cold air infiltrating through the outer canvas was warmed by the inner liner before it ever entered the living space. Warm air radiating from the interior was captured in the gap, creating an insulating layer that conventional cabins simply couldn't achieve. The inner liner itself was installed with a technique Whitfield had learned from a Cheyenne elder named Tall Horse. It was attached to the lodge poles only at the top, hanging free at the bottom. This created a controlled convection loop. Cool air was pulled down between the two layers, warmed as it descended, then released into the living space at ground level where the liner ended, already heated, already part of the thermal system. Measured by principles the settlers had never heard of, Whitfield's design was capturing and redirecting heat that the log cabins were simply throwing away. The central fire pit contributed another advantage. In a cabin with a corner fireplace, heat radiated primarily in one direction, leaving the far corners perpetually cold. Whitfield's central fire radiated equally in all directions, 360 degrees of coverage. The stone lining absorbed heat during active burning, then released it slowly for hours after the flames died. He'd even calculated the geometry. The teepee's 16-foot diameter created 201 square feet of floor space. With a 14-foot peak height, the total volume was approximately 940 cubic feet, 35% less air to heat than Bradshaw's cabin, which had 1,440 cubic feet crammed into its rectangular space. Less volume, better circulation, radiant efficiency, thermal mass storage. But try explaining thermodynamics to men who'd built successful cabins the same way for 3 generations. All that fancy rigging, Bradshaw said, examining the double wall system one December morning. You're just making work for yourself. Thick logs and a hot fire. That's all a man needs. Whitfield didn't argue. He just added another stone to his fire pit and waited for winter to make his argument for him. January 12, 1878. The blizzard came screaming out of Canada with a ferocity that veterans of 20 Montana winters said they'd never witnessed. By dawn, the temperature had plunged to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that men's breath froze in their beards before they could exhale fully, cold enough that the sap in standing pine trees exploded with sounds like rifle shots. In the log cabins, desperation set in fast. Jacob Hensley's family was burning wood at an unsustainable rate, a full cord consumed in just 70 hours, and still the interior temperature hovered at a brutal 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost formed on the interior walls in elaborate crystalline patterns. The children slept in layers of every garment they owned, huddled together under buffalo robes, and still they shivered. Henry Bradshaw's situation was even worse. His massive fireplace, fed with split pine and aspen around the clock, was creating such a strong draft that it was actually pulling cold air through every tiny gap in the chinked walls. The more wood he burned, the more frigid air got sucked into his cabin. By the second night of the storm, ice was forming on the water bucket just 8 feet from a roaring fire. Samuel Morton, the man who'd bragged about his 43-tree walls, was chopping frozen splits with numb fingers, calculating grimly that his wood supply wouldn't last another week at this consumption rate. And then there was Whitfield's teepee. On the morning of January 14th, when the storm briefly cleared, Jacob Hensley made his way through hip-deep snow to check on the fool who'd chosen to winter in a tent. What he found made no sense. Smoke rose lazily from the teepee's peak, a thin, almost casual stream that suggested a modest fire, nothing like the roaring blazes consuming cords of wood in the cabins. Hensley approached the entrance, brushing aside the canvas flap. The warmth hit him like a physical force. Inside, Thomas Whitfield sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves, working on a beaver pelt. The interior was impossibly warm enough that Whitfield had actually rolled up the bottom edge of the inner liner to allow cooler air to circulate. Ow! Was all Hensley could manage. Whitfield gestured to a small thermometer hanging from a lodge pole. It read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the temperature was still minus 29 degrees Fahrenheit. That was a 97-degree difference, maintained by a fire that consumed perhaps one-fifth the wood Hensley was burning. "The fire's barely going," Hensley said, staring at the modest flames in the central pit. "Doesn't need to be roaring," Whitfield replied calmly. "The stones hold the heat. The walls trap it. The shape moves it where it needs to go. Been comfortable for 3 days now on about 6 hours of burning per day." Hensley did the math in his head. 6 hours of fire. Maybe 12 pounds of wood per hour. 72 pounds of fuel total over 3 days. He'd personally burned over 800 pounds in the same period and was still freezing. "You need to show Bradshaw this," Hensley said quietly. "And Morton. Hell, everyone." Word spread within hours. By nightfall, 7 men had made the trek through the snow to witness what should have been impossible. The evidence was undeniable, measurable, reproducible. The savage's tent was outperforming every cabin in the valley by metrics that couldn't be dismissed as luck or exaggeration. Within a week, the measurements were being recorded with the kind of precision that turned skepticism into stunned acceptance. Henry Bradshaw, the former quartermaster who understood logistics and supply chains, brought his own thermometer and spent 6 hours documenting the thermal performance of Whitfield's shelter versus his own cabin. The data was devastating to conventional wisdom. Interior temperature maintenance. Whitfield's teepee, 68 degrees Fahrenheit average, ranging from 64 degrees Fahrenheit to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on fire activity. Average log cabin, 23 degrees Fahrenheit to 31 degrees Fahrenheit, with extreme fluctuations near the fireplace fuel consumption. Per 24-hour period at minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit ambient. Whitfield's teepee, 144 pounds of mixed pine and aspen. Bradshaw's cabin, 360 pounds minimum, often exceeding 400 pounds. Morton's cabin, 425 pounds, due to larger interior volume. That meant Whitfield was achieving interior temperatures 40 to 45 degrees warmer while burning 60% less wood. But the numbers that really shocked the settlers came from heat retention testing. Bradshaw documented what happened when fires were allowed to die completely. Heat retention after fire extinction. Whitfield's teepee maintained 55 degrees Fahrenheit or above for 6 to 8 hours. Log cabins dropped below 40 degrees Fahrenheit within 90 minutes to 2 hours. The difference was the thermal mass. Whitfield's circular stone fire pit, comprising approximately 240 pounds of dense river rock, was absorbing heat during active burning and releasing it steadily for hours afterward. The stones acted like a thermal battery, storing energy when abundant and dispensing it when needed. The log cabins had stone fireplaces, yes, but those stones were radiating most of their heat up the chimney, not into the living space. The convection system made an equally dramatic difference. Jacob Hensley, who'd studied basic mechanics in a Pennsylvania schoolhouse, sketched diagrams trying to explain what he was observing. In Whitfield's teepee, warm air rose to the peak, spread laterally across the inner liner, then descended along the outer walls in the buffer zone. Cool air was pre-warmed before entering the living space. The result was continuous, gentle circulation with minimal temperature stratification. In the cabins, hot air pooled uselessly against the ceiling near the fireplace, while frigid air sat heavy along the floor and in the corners. The temperature difference between ceiling and floor in Morton's cabin measured 34 degrees, an absurd inefficiency. Even the geometry contributed measurable advantages. The conical shape meant wind couldn't create pressure zones. Snow slid off naturally, preventing structural loading. The circular floor plan eliminated the dead corners where cabin builders lost heat to stagnant air. Samuel Morton, the man who'd mocked the circus tent, sat in Whitfield's dwelling on January 23rd and finally asked the question they'd all been avoiding. Why didn't we know this? Whitfield fed another split of pine into his modest fire. Because you assumed that people who'd lived in this climate for 1,000 years hadn't figured out the engineering. You thought thick logs meant better insulation. But what is a thermal bridge? It conducts heat right through to the outside. You thought big fireplaces meant more warmth. But they mostly heat the sky. The Blackfeet, the Cheyenne, the Lakota, they solved these problems generations ago. They just didn't write it down in ways that settlers recognized as knowledge. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind outside and the soft crackle of Whitfield's fire. Engineering, it turned out, wasn't about showing dominance over nature. It was about understanding it well enough to work with its principles instead of against them. By February 1878, the question was no longer whether Whitfield's design worked. The question was how fast the community could learn to replicate it. Spring arrived in Montana Territory with the kind of gentle warmth that made the previous winter feel like a distant nightmare. But the lessons of January 1878 hadn't faded. On March 17th, Jacob Hensley became the first settler to approach Thomas Whitfield with a request that would have been unthinkable 4 months earlier. "I want to learn how to build one of these properly," Hensley said, standing outside Whitfield's teepee as meltwater dripped from the pines. "Not just for myself, for my boys, so they know there's more than one way to survive out here." Whitfield nodded slowly. "You'll need to learn from someone better than me. The real knowledge belongs to the people who perfected this over centuries." Within 2 weeks, Whitfield had arranged something unprecedented in that corner of Montana Territory. A formal teaching exchange with a Blackfeet band camped along the Jocko River. 3 elders, 2 guns, Standing Wolf, and a woman named Beaver Woman agreed to demonstrate proper teepee construction in exchange for iron tools and wool blankets. What followed was a masterclass in engineering that the settlers would reference for decades. Beaver Woman explained the critical importance of the inner liner installation, showing exactly how the suspension system created the thermal buffer zone. The liner must hang loose at the bottom, she demonstrated, using a teaching lodge they'd erected specifically for instruction. If you tie it down, you kill the air movement. The warmth must flow. Standing Wolf taught the mathematics of lodge pole selection. 15 poles for a 16-foot dwelling, each one precisely 22 feet long, peeled and fire-hardened at the base. "The angle matters," he said, demonstrating the 67-degree pitch that created optimal smoke draw. "Too steep and wind pushes smoke back down. Too shallow and heat escapes too fast." 2 guns focused on the fire management system that Whitfield had replicated. He showed the settlers how to select stones. Dense creek stones that held heat without cracking, arranged in a specific pattern that channeled radiant energy outward rather than allowing it to escape downward into the earth. "You see these stones?" 2 guns said, pointing to the flat river rocks forming the pit's outer ring. "They reflect heat back into the lodge. These inner stones, the round ones, they store it. Different stones, different jobs. This is not accident. This is knowing." By late May 1878, 7 families had constructed modified winter lodges based on the Blackfeet instruction. They weren't abandoning their log cabins entirely. The cabins still served for storage, livestock shelter, and summer living. But for winter survival, the thermal efficiency of the teepee design was simply too significant to ignore. Henry Bradshaw, the former quartermaster who'd once called Whitfield a fool, became one of the most enthusiastic adopters. He documented his construction process with military precision, creating diagrams and measurements that he shared freely with new settlers arriving in the valley. His notes from November 1878 recorded the transformation. Erected lodge 16 feet diameter, 14 feet peak height, following Standing Wolf's pole arrangement exactly. Double wall system installed per Beaver Woman's instruction. Stone pit comprises 267 pounds creek stone, selected for density. First cold night, exterior temp 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Maintained interior 61 degrees Fahrenheit with modest fire. Wood consumption approximately 1/3 previous winter's cabin usage. The efficiency is undeniable. Samuel Morton, who'd bragged about his 43-tree cabin, took a different approach. He combined technologies, adding an interior liner system to his existing cabin while maintaining his traditional fireplace. The results were measurable but modest, perhaps a 15% improvement in fuel efficiency. The fundamental geometry of the square structure simply couldn't match the conical design's convection properties. By the winter of 1878 to 1879, 23 modified shelters based on native engineering principles were in use within a 50-mile radius of Stevensville. The local trading post began stocking canvas specifically for teepee construction. A carpenter named William Jessup started offering specialized lodgepole preparation as a service. The social transformation went beyond construction techniques. Families that had previously viewed native peoples solely through the lens of frontier conflict began recognizing them as engineers, as teachers, as holders of sophisticated environmental knowledge. It wasn't universal. Prejudice and violence still defined much of the frontier relationship. But in this particular valley, at this particular moment, survival needs had created a bridge across a cultural divide. Two Guns summarized it with characteristic directness during a December visit. You thought we were primitive because we lived in skin houses. We thought you were stupid because you burned so much wood to stay cold. Now you learn. Maybe both sides were partly wrong. The validation came during the winter of 1879, when temperatures again plunged below -30 degrees Fahrenheit for a week-long stretch. The families using the improved designs weathered the cold with confidence. Wood supplies that would have been exhausted in previous winters lasted comfortably. Children slept warm. No one faced the desperate fuel calculations that had marked the winter of 1878. Jacob Hensley's teenage son, Peter, kept a detailed journal that winter. His entry from January 9th, 1879, captured the transformation. Father says this is what learning looks like. Not just accepting what you're taught, but being willing to recognize when someone else knows better. The Blackfeet weren't showing us a trick. They were teaching us engineering we'd been too proud to see. If you're finding value in this knowledge, techniques that literally saved lives and transformed a community, show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing. Drop a comment telling me what traditional knowledge from your region has been forgotten or dismissed. Because this story isn't just about Montana in 1878. It's about what we lose when we assume progress only moves in one direction, and what we gain when we're humble enough to learn. The winter shelter revolution in Montana's Bitterroot Valley didn't end with the 1870s. By 1885, modified teepee designs and hybrid structures incorporating native thermal engineering principles were documented across western Montana, northern Idaho, and even parts of Wyoming territory. The knowledge spread through settler networks, through word of mouth, through the pragmatic recognition that survival trumped cultural prejudice. Thomas Whitfield himself moved north in 1881, continuing his trapping work along the Milk River. But he left behind something more valuable than pelts or trade goods. He'd left a community that had learned to question its assumptions about knowledge and progress. The ironies ran deep. These were settlers from the industrialized East, from regions with universities and technical schools and published engineering treatises. They'd arrived in Montana with confidence in their superior knowledge, their advanced civilization, their modern methods. And they'd nearly frozen to death while dismissing as primitive an engineering solution that was demonstrably superior in every measurable way. The thermal efficiency of the teepee design wasn't magic or luck. It was physics rigorously applied over centuries of observation and refinement. The Blackfeet, Cheyenne, Lakota, and other Plains peoples had conducted the largest long-term thermal engineering experiment in human history. Hundreds of generations testing materials, geometries, and heat management strategies in some of Earth's harshest winter conditions. They'd solve problems that European-trained builders hadn't even properly identified. The conical geometry that eliminated thermal dead zones. The double-wall convection system that pre-warmed incoming air. The central radiant heating that distributed warmth equally. The thermal mass storage that extended heat retention for hours after active burning ceased. The adjustable smoke hole that balanced draft and heat loss. Every element served a specific, calculated purpose. Modern building science, with its sophisticated instruments and computer modeling, has since validated what those communities knew empirically. For mobile or temporary structures in extreme cold, the teepee design achieves thermal performance that conventional rectangular architecture simply cannot match at equivalent material and labor inputs. Contemporary off-grid builders and survival specialists have rediscovered these principles, often without knowing the historical precedent. Canvas wall tents with interior liners. Conical emergency shelters. Thermal mass heating systems. The engineering is sound because the engineering always was sound. The lesson extends beyond shelter construction. What happened in Montana Territory in 1878 was a small-scale demonstration of a pattern that has repeated throughout human history. The dangerous assumption that indigenous or traditional knowledge represents a primitive stage that progress has surpassed. In reality, traditional knowledge often represents deeply sophisticated solutions to local environmental challenges, solutions refined across time scales that modern engineering, for all its theoretical power, simply cannot replicate. The Blackfeet understood thermodynamics not through abstract calculation, but through the empirical method applied relentlessly. Build, test, observe, modify, repeat across generations. Their textbook was survival itself. Their laboratory was winter. Their peer review was life and death. When Henry Bradshaw documented his first winter in a properly constructed lodge, he included a note that modern readers should consider carefully. I had thought knowledge flowed in one direction only, from civilization to wilderness, from the educated to the primitive, from those who read to those who remember. This winter has taught me that wisdom lives wherever careful observation meets hard necessity. The Blackfeet had been engineering thermal efficiency while my ancestors were still burning forests to stay barely warm in drafty castles. By the early 1900s, as railroads brought conventional lumber and coal heating became economical, the widespread use of teepees among white settlers declined. The log cabin, with its cultural cachet and permanent foundation, reasserted itself as the dominant frontier architecture. But the knowledge didn't disappear entirely. It lived in family histories, in regional building practices, in the hybrid designs that incorporated thermal mass principles into more conventional structures. And it lived in the broader recognition that engineering sophistication and cultural advancement were not synonymous. Thomas Whitfield died in 1903, largely forgotten by the broader historical record. He left no published writings, no patents, no formal legacy. But in the Bitterroot Valley, his name remained attached to a simple idea, that survival depends less on the tools you bring than on the wisdom you're willing to learn. The settlers who mocked his weird tent in 1877 had been operating from a framework that equated European construction methods with superior knowledge. They'd invested labor and resources into shelters that were measurably inefficient, then defended those methods because acknowledging the alternative meant admitting they'd been wrong. It had taken a crisis, temperatures that killed livestock and threatened children, to break through that defensive certainty. In the end, it wasn't Thomas Whitfield who taught the settlers about thermal engineering. It was January. It was minus 38 degrees. It was the brutal empiricism of Montana, winter, measuring their assumptions against physical reality and finding those assumptions fatally inadequate. Whitfield had just been willing to learn before the crisis forced him to. The lesson remains relevant today, perhaps more than ever. In an era of climate change, resource scarcity, and technological disruption, the assumption that traditional knowledge is obsolete has proven repeatedly wrong. Indigenous fire management techniques, ancient water harvesting systems, traditional crop varieties, architectural solutions refined across centuries. The knowledge is there. The question is whether we're humble enough to recognize it. As Beaver Woman said during that teaching exchange in 1878, explaining why the Blackfeet were willing to share their engineering knowledge with settlers who'd often been hostile. You cannot keep warmth by holding it selfishly. It spreads or it dies. Knowledge is the same. We teach you not because you deserve it, but because the children deserve to be warm. And because maybe if you understand how much you didn't know, you will be less quick to call us primitive. The teepee that stayed 45 degrees warmer wasn't weird. It was simply better engineering than the alternative. And recognizing that required only one thing: the willingness to measure results honestly, whatever those measurements revealed about the settlers' prior assumptions. In Montana Territory in 1878, a handful of families learned that lesson in time. The rest of us are still learning it. This isn't just a story about shelter construction in the 1870s. It's about the cost of arrogance and the value of intellectual humility. It's about recognizing that engineering wisdom can emerge from any culture that faces environmental challenges seriously enough and observed carefully enough over sufficient time. The frontier settlers who dismissed the teepee as primitive weren't stupid. They were operating from a framework that equated their cultural background with superior knowledge. It took a measurable crisis, temperatures that could be read on thermometers, fuel consumption that could be weighed and counted, to break through that framework. Modern off-grid builders, homesteaders, and survival specialists can learn from both sides of this historical example. Learn the physics, test the assumptions, measure the results, and be willing to acknowledge when traditional knowledge, refined across generations, has already solved the problem you're facing. Because the warmest shelter isn't always the one with the thickest walls or the biggest fireplace. Sometimes it's the one that works with natural principles instead of trying to overpower them through brute force. If this story changed how you think about traditional knowledge and engineering, do 3 things. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel for more forgotten frontier wisdom, and drop a comment sharing what traditional techniques from your region deserve more recognition. Let's build a community that values knowledge wherever it comes from. The settlers learned that lesson in time to survive. Let's make sure we do too.